Welcome to the Clearly Christian Podcast with Dr. Cy Smith. It's time to know more so you can say no more. It's time for the Clearly Christian Podcast. Here's your host, Dr. Cy Smith.
I'm Dr. Cy Smith, and this is Clearly Christian, a podcast about what it means to see the world from God's perspective, and then the impact that this has on training the next generation to live a life consistent with a biblical worldview. If you like the show, you've been listening for a while, I'd encourage you to hit the subscribe button or leave a review. That'll let others know that the show is worth listening to, and it'll certainly help advance the cause of Christian education. Our guest today is Mrs. Maria Baer. She's a reporter, a podcaster, and a mom, among many other roles that she has. She's the co-host of the weekly Breakpoint This podcast with John Stonestreet at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. She's an accomplished writer, a thinker, and a speaker on biblical worldview, and I know you're going to enjoy our conversation today. But first, let's go to school. Today, I need you to know more about what it will take in this culture to raise a child that is mentally, emotionally, and spiritually healthy. There's a book sweeping the country right now, and it's being read by people at the highest levels of government. In fact, several state legislatures are working through proposals to implement some of its recommendations. The book's entitled The Anxious Generation: How the Great Rewiring of Childhood is Causing an Epidemic of Mental Illness. And the author is Jonathan Haidt. He's a social psychologist. You know, it's commonly understood that today's youth are the most anxious generation in history. I've said that before on this show. That's probably not any surprise. But the central claim of the book is there are two major reasons for this: overprotection in the real world and underprotection in the virtual world. He refers to the time between 2010 and 2015 as the period of the Great Rewiring, he calls it, where children all over the world were given smartphones in what he calls the largest uncontrolled experiment humanity has ever performed on its own children. Quite a powerful statement there. As tech companies on the West Coast created a set of world-changing products, he writes, little to no research had been done on the mental health effects of these products on children and adolescents. They hooked children during those vulnerable stages while their brains were rapidly developing in response to that incoming stimulation. Social media companies inflicted their greatest damage on girls, while video companies and video game companies and pornography sites sank their deepest hooks into boys, writes the author. This is what parents are up against today. There's just no doubt that technology has changed the way we raise children. Haidt makes this key point in the book, and here's where I want you to focus on. He says the human transition from child to adult depends in part on getting the right kinds of experiences at the right time in order to guide this rapid rewiring of the adolescent brain. Because adolescence is such a rapid time of brain development, second only to very small infancy, we should be concerned, he says, about those experiences and not let strangers or algorithms choose them. What he's saying, of course, is that it matters what goes into a child's mind and what kinds of experiences they have, because these things will determine their mental health and their emotional well-being. And right now, it's not going well for about 90% of the nation's children. Listen, building an education system that leaves God out has caught up with our country, and now it's catching up with the nation's children. We don't want to rewire our children to exist in a culture that produces enough anxiety and depression to reach epidemic levels of mental illness. Christian schools work with the home and church to wire our children according to God's natural design for them, wiring them to understand that they were made in His image and they can have confidence in what they're learning at school. Let's make two chalkboard points for you to consider remembering. Chalkboard point number one. It's a fact that humans were made in God's image, and this reality impacts everything about you. We are wired to mature from children to adults according to God's design. Even atheist researchers recognize the importance of getting the right kinds of experiences at the right times. You can't ignore this truth, ignore God's designs and purposes, and then expect to raise a generation of happy and healthy children. It's just not going to work. Chalkboard point number two, the years of upper elementary and middle school are absolutely crucial for the healthy mental, emotional, and spiritual development of children. As a parent, this is not a time to take chances with strangers and algorithms, as Jonathan Haidt puts it. Christian education is designed to lead children into a right understanding of who they are. Government schools are not designed for this, and the devastating effects are all around us. From our policies to our playgrounds, our nation's in trouble. And now you know more. And as I like to say, when you know more, you can do more. You can not only think differently, but you can act differently, and you can say no more if you must. And so with that, let's go ahead and again put this lesson plan into action and welcome our guest in. Again, Maria, so great to have you here. Thanks so much for joining me on Clearly Christian.
I'm so excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Oh, perfect. As I said, she's a reporter, a writer, a podcaster. She is really a podcast pro. So again, it's great to learn from her even in this setting. She's the co-host of the weekly Breakpoint This Week, as I said, with John Stonestreet. She's a writer for Breakpoint also. She's also published regularly in Christianity Today magazine, World Magazine, and the Gospel Coalition. She's based in Columbus, Ohio, graduated with a Bachelor of Science degree in journalism from the Ohio University Scripps School of Journalism in 2009. Lives in Columbus with her husband, Aaron, who's also the president of the Ohio's Center for Christian Virtue. And her children also are blessed to attend a Christian school. So again, thank you so much for joining me. Listen, you do such great work with John Stonestreet on Breakpoint and the Colson Center. I'm a regular listener, not as often as I want to, probably like all of us in our podcast, but we try to listen as much as we possibly can. I just honestly don't know how you do it, keeping everything, all those balls in the air, and keeping all these subjects in mind. I mean, you guys are talking about the last episode I listened to a couple weeks ago, you're talking about everything under the sun: abortion, immigration, gender identity, education, racism, Israel, Palestine. I mean, you're touching on so many things. How do you handle those things even as a leader, mentally and emotionally? What topics, hey, I'm going to focus on this because this really bothers me and this is really where I go at. But how do you narrow your focus down? Or are you just studying culture all the time?
Oh, that's a great question. I think, the blessing of my work and Aaron's work as the president of CCV, as you mentioned, is that I feel like we were really clearly wired for this. I mean, obviously this was a call from the Lord. And I say that because even if we weren't doing what we're doing, we would still be talking about these issues. And I think, it's the desires that the Lord has put into our hearts, that we care for not just our kids, but our neighbors' kids and our friends' kids. And that, it's hard not to live in the world today and not be concerned with a lot of these issues. Now, in terms of keeping them straight, I mean, I really do look to John for that. You're very kind to say so many kind words about our podcast on Breakpoint, and I truly love doing that with John Stonestreet at the Colson Center. I kind of joke, and I've told friends before, that I feel like I get to go to seminary without having to pay for it because he is such an incredible teacher and thinker. And so a lot of times our conversations on Breakpoint are just me I think maybe my gifting is coming up with questions, right? So like looking at what's going on around us and then trying to work my way through it. And we end up having, I think, some really good conversations on that podcast because I'm able to kind of wrestle in real time with a lot of these issues and throw it to John. And then just, sit kind of at his feet, which is a blessing. I also think, it's now that we have children, and you mentioned we have two children, 2 daughters, they are 8 and 5. And so a lot of, when you have children, a lot of stuff comes into sharp relief, a lot of cultural realities, as, including Jonathan Haidt's book, for example. I mean, your intro was so crucial and is probably one of the top issues facing our kids. And I think for us, it's inevitable that we're thinking through these things because we have these two blessings that God has entrusted to us, and we need to think through what's best for them and, frankly, what's not best for them. And so that kind of keeps things real on a daily basis.
Yeah, great. Yeah, I love that. I love that phrase, wrestle with it in real time as well. That's so good because I think the listeners sense that this is not something staged. I mean, she's thinking through this. Those questions are genuine. And I can see, you can almost tell that you're reflecting even as I listen to you there. And so that's big. How did you and John connect originally? I mean, where did your paths cross that you even got into this line of work? Yeah.
It's so funny. I mean, I look back and I'm sure I'll do this again, in 20 years of looking back now. You can just see God's hand orchestrating all these things. So in college, I mean, I went to Ohio University, a very secular university, but also a very prestigious journalism school. And I had a wonderful advisor who was very open-minded. I don't know if it's the same there now, but I wanted to intern at Focus on the Family. Every journalism student at Ohio University has to have a writing internship. And at that time, Focus on the Family was hiring interns for their magazine for teen girls, which I had read growing up, Brio, and I loved. And that's where I wanted to intern. And I remember my my advisor saying, like, "Are you serious? You want to go to Focus on the Family? Are you serious?" You know, this is a very secular atheist guy. And I said, "Yes, that's what I want to do." And he was like, "Okay, let's do it." So I was blessed to get that internship. I spent a semester out in Colorado Springs with Focus on the Family, writing for Brio and working for them. And that was really formative time. And then, you know, came back home to Ohio, graduated, and then just slowly started writing and trying to build up my writing portfolio while doing other jobs at the same time. You know, Aaron and I got married right after graduation. And then we got involved with the Family Policy Council movement. We actually lived in Arizona for a while, and Aaron was working for the sort of equivalent of CCV out in Arizona called the Center for Arizona Policy. And through that work, we met John. You know, he's doing a lot of teaching and speaking in that space as well. And I think we were at an event and he and I were sitting together eating dinner. I think it must have been an event that Aaron was speaking at because Aaron wasn't sitting with us. And we left the dinner and John said, you should write for us. And, you know, and our relationship just grew from there. So it's, you know, it's just kind of all snowballed from there, but we've been all over the place.
Yeah, that's great. And like you said, just how God's planned that for you, orchestrated that for you. And his hand was obviously in it because I think you're a perfect fit there, perfect match. And I think you just lend so much to that particular program. And so, no disrespect to John, but we're all big fans that you guys are all together there, right?
Yeah, we have a lot of fun
doing that. Right. And as a Colson Fellow in training, I can say that, right? Because I'm an insider now.
So this is the joke is I'm so intimidated by that because I actually have not done the Colson Fellows program. It feels I'm too intimidated by it. It is so rigorous. But that's awesome.
You should have done it. Yes, you should have done it. Right. If I would have known that, I would have talked you into doing it with me in this particular cohort.
People are always trying to talk me into it. I think once my kids get a little older, at least that's the excuse I give everybody. Once my littles are a tiny bit older, then
Yes. Well, if it's any consolation, I had made excuses for years and years and years, and I finally ran out of them. We're empty nesters now, and so I said, listen, it's now or never. I'm never going to be less busy. So I'm just biting it off right now. But such a great program. And we'll come back to that. Well, you mentioned the girls, 8 and 5, fantastic. I know I've heard you say before, you both, Aaron and you, have public school backgrounds, and yet the girls go to Christian school. Well, what point in your pairing did you decide? Tell us a little bit about that story. Did you say, okay, we're going to make a change for our daughters because we're seeing things maybe a little differently than we once did?
Right. Yeah, exactly. Well, the situation on the ground changed, honestly. We both, like I said, we both went to public schools and I had a great experience and I know Aaron did too. But that was a long time ago. I don't want to age myself here, but when our first was born, we live in an urban area. We live in Columbus, Ohio, and that was when we started looking around. We had friends from church that sent their kids to a local Christian school, and at first we were kind of nervous about the price tag. We didn't know a lot about it and a lot about the resources that were actually available to help with that. But we started looking around and really quickly realized that, I'm not exaggerating here, every public school in our city school district has a failing grade from the state and has for at least, I think, 5 years, probably more. So that was our first sort of red flag, even before considering cultural issues, which were obviously important to us as well. And I think are connected to the academic issues as well, but just, we were alarmed. I mean, kids in our school, the literacy rate for fourth graders in our school district, our public school district, is 23%, which is outrageous. I mean, it is just a full scale failing of kids and families in this area. So, as soon as we started hearing about this, we were like, okay, so that's not an option, just even academically speaking. But then, we started to see all of these ideological concerns going on in the public schools and really started to see too how these are directly connected. Because if you think about it, if you've got schools who are prioritizing things like conversations about race and gender in kindergarten and who are more concerned with, the desires of their teachers' unions than they are about the academic performance of their kids and what their kids need and what their school buildings need. I mean, a couple years ago, all of the schools in Columbus City were late in starting the school year because they didn't have functioning air conditioning. But if you look at the ballooning funding that they've been receiving year after year, there's really no excuse for that. So it's clear to me that the misprioritization in favor of sort of progressive ideology has directly contributed to the failure of these schools to teach kids, which again makes sense from a philosophical perspective. Because if you have a school that's willing to teach kids, for example, that I don't know if you're a girl or a boy because there's no fixed reality and you get to decide that and we get to make whatever is true. And, or you have schools teaching things like math is inherently racist or, there's no such thing as true and false. And then of course we would be wise to question, are these schools able to teach my kids to read? Are they able to teach my kids science? Because all truth is God's truth. And if they're teaching lies in one area, it would be unwise of us not to assume they're going to be teaching lies in all areas. And the snowball just went downhill from there. And we thought there's no way. I mean, we would do just about anything to protect them from that schooling experience. And I think it's really important to say here too, that is our desire. We think every single child deserves better than that. This is not just about, I want my kids to hear about the Old Testament at school. I love that they do because it's reinforcing what we're teaching them at home. But I want them to actually learn about the world as it is. And I want every kid to have that opportunity, which is why I think, this Christian education movement is so important.
Yeah, that's a great point. Great point. And I think more Christians would do well to heed that advice and listen and say, really, and COVID did help that a little bit because it exposed some things. Hey, take a deep dive into what's going on at your local school because you probably are going to be surprised. Just as you said, things have changed drastically since we all went to school. Even 5, 7, 10 years ago, we're telling parents now, as those of us that are running schools, that do not assume everybody thinks they know schooling because they were once a student. Do not assume that it's anything like the experience you once had. And I think you're right in that Haidt would say the same thing in his book that, listen, the whole thing has changed, especially since, about 2015. And we're just starting to uncover just how much. And I'm not certainly attributing all of this to the smartphone as he is, because a lot of this is the culture propelling this, or I should say giving momentum to this, because, the phone is just the phone without people on the other sides putting all this thing together here. And we know the human nature behind what's driving this technology. But I don't think, parents are quite as aware of really, even if they are ideologically on a different page, they might be shocked at exactly the level of educational value, the quality, as you mentioned. Moeller had a great piece here recently in the briefing, and I can't remember the exact phrase, but it's something like, man, this is a group that is failing educationally, but certainly winning ideologically, so to speak, because we're putting so much effort into that as driven by, massive, nationwide teachers unions and things of that nature that they're so consumed with driving this radical ideology down kids' throats in the forms of curriculum and things like that, that we're forgetting some of these basic things like literacy that you pointed out. So, yeah, great. I love too that you get involved there, and it's not that, hey, I'm gonna just leave this all to them. You're a recess monitor. I love that that you're seeing your girls on a regular basis. Are you? How great has that been to be able to watch your kids and maybe notice what are some things that you've noticed that are like, wow, this is so great to see this at a Christian school when my girls are young.
Oh, it's the very best. So I always joke about this. When my youngest she went to pre-K at this school, before kindergarten. And I signed up to be a recess monitor then. In part, I would like to say it's because the school really needed help and they were asking parents for help, and I just happened to be very generous. But the truth is, I was having a little bit of an emotional crisis about my baby leaving home, and so I thought, I'll get to go be with her a couple days a week. But actually, I have loved it so much that I was talking to Aaron last night, and he said, "Are you going to keep doing this even after the girls move on to middle school?" And I was like, "I think I might, just because kids in this age group are just so I just love every minute of it. They're so sweet and cute, and also they think all my jokes are funny, and they just think I'm so cool, and that never gets old. So it's such a treat being there. But there is something remarkably special about this school, and I know that it's primarily because from the top down, the purpose of the school is to train disciples of Christ, and they are very dogged about the fact that being a follower of Jesus means learning who he is and learning about the world as it is and learning about ourselves as we are, which means, again, like I said, all truth is God's truth. They are learning like rigorous world history, geology, math, obviously literacy is a big one. But all these things can reveal the truth about God's word and himself and his world. And that is absolutely happening there. I also see, it's a lot of the in-between interactions that are so meaningful and mean so much to me. The other day, my daughter had a bloody nose, at recess. This happens to her when the weather changes sometimes. And the fact that every person in the office, her teacher, they're just saying a prayer for her. They're going to sit with her until it's finished, or that a lot of times teachers will help kids resolve conflicts. At other times, teachers deliberately do not help kids resolve conflicts so that the kids can have the opportunity to learn how to do that themselves. There's just this intentionality about how to treat kids as actual human beings. Like Jonathan Haidt was saying, it is so critical that kids have certain experiences at the right time and that they don't have them at the wrong time and they don't have the wrong experiences at the wrong time. And these teachers know that because they know the Bible. They know about kids. They know what kids are and what kids need. And I just see that intentionality. Whereas I think in a lot of public schools, understandably, they're so overwhelmed with so many kids, with so many different needs. And they're under so much scrutiny and so many rules that their chief concern is sort of like a checklist of duties. They're not always looking at kids as human beings who need to learn, about not just literature and, physics and math, but also need to learn about how to be social with one another and what it means to be human and why we're here. And so the fact that that's reinforced at school and is done so intentionally is just a wonderful thing.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And I feel the same whenever I need a pick-me-up or an encouragement of any kind. I go right down to the elementary where I know I'm going to get lots of hugs. That's exactly right. They think I'm a big deal, right? They all say, oh Dr. Smith. They think I'm the president. They call me crazy things. They don't understand the role of the superintendent. They don't get that, I'm running everything. They just think it's a big deal when he walks in the hallway. So I love it. I welcome the hugs. It's always a great experience to go down there. So I know exactly what you're saying. So keep it up. That's great. And so
I walked
go ahead.
I walked into a kindergarten classroom last year, and one of the kids said, "Who are you?" And I said, "Oh, you don't know me. I'm the queen of the school." And for about 8 months, I had that kindergarten class believe that I was the queen of the school, and I lived on the roof, and I came down to check on them every once in a while. And it was the cutest thing. Great. I loved it.
That's great. Yeah, that is great. Yep, that's so good. So good. Love hearing those parent stories as well when they go home and tell mom and dad about those things. The Queen visited us today.
I know. Exactly.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So well, you mentioned, Haidt's book, and I was going to come back to that as well. Were you familiar with the book and what I was saying there? I thought, again, he did a good job. Yes. And as I said, he's an atheist. But he's also recognizing that, wow, we've got some issues here that would be solved by maybe going a whole different direction with how we view childhood and his view, of course, pulling away technology and things like that. But do you talk much about that with John and the culture and the anxiety and depression of young people? Have you done any research there or looked at that?
Absolutely. Yeah. Actually, Aaron and I went on our girls, we went on a road trip this summer, and we read that book to each other back and forth in the car while we were driving. But we had to stop frequently and pray because, I'm so glad he wrote it, but it's kind of dire. It's difficult to read in some parts. But yes, we've talked about it on Breakpoint this week as well. And actually, I relied on Jonathan Haidt's work heavily. I recently contributed a chapter to a book put together by Katie Faust. She is an advocate for children's rights. She runs an organization out of Seattle called Them Before Us. And the book was called, it just came out last month, and it's called Pro-Child Politics. And her idea is, you know, what if we looked at every major issue, especially in a political season, and we asked ourselves, how do we protect kids first? You know, when we're looking at this issue, and the issue that she asked me to write about was digital technology. So I relied very heavily on a lot of Jonathan Haidt's work here, and found a lot of other research as well to back up what he's saying. Not just about the physiology of our brains, but also the more philosophical, you know, existential questions about what kind of people we are and what children are and what they need. And I think there's some really fascinating sort of physiological, almost like metaphors for the way God wired us and built us. So, for example, one of the things I found was this incredible study that was actually started, I think, in the 70s. It might have been early 80s. But it was at that point, obviously, the only, you know, real digital screens that they were researching was the television. But they were looking at how repeated viewing of electronic screens changed, you know, brain chemistry or the way our minds work. And what they found was that over, you know, a 5-year period and then a 10-year period, people who regularly view, especially children and adolescents who regularly are looking at screens, their ability to differentiate shades of color and their ability to differentiate sounds is diminished. And I think that is a really fascinating picture for sort of some of the larger issues that he's getting at, which is exposure to technology, too much exposure too early, and the wrong kind of exposure. All of those things can contribute to literally changing the way our brains are able to process the world, which I think points to the fact that God made us minds and bodies and spirit, right? Which means we learn not just with our minds, we learn not just with our bodies. We need both. And we need our spirit as well, which is what he gives us. But if you think about, you know, the importance of being outside physically and what we know that does even for our physiology, for the cells in our body, but also our brains and our ability to learn. The fact that you retain so much more information when you physically write it down than when you type it. You know, when you're taking notes or whatever it is. You retain and remember more information for longer when you read it on a physical page as opposed to reading a digital book or an article. And of course, we all know about, you know, the shortening of the attention spans because of all the time spent on screens and social media. And those all point to very real things about the way God made us, and especially children, which is they need to learn with their bodies as well as their minds. And unfortunately, I think a lot of the digital tech, especially in education, like Google has made this huge push really since 2014. They're, you know, sending massive amounts of Chromebooks to every public school in America saying, this is going to revolutionize your classroom. It's going to help everybody learn. And of course, the pandemic made this worse, but that makes some really big assumptions about what learning is. And I think the main assumption is it just requires your mind. You don't need any other parts of you. And we know that's just not true.
No, absolutely. Yep, absolutely. The research is pretty clear. When you can get all 5 senses involved in the learning process, the potential to hold into long-term memory far greater. And it's not even close versus just auditory or just one of those, you know, 5 senses. And ask any CEO or a superintendent or teacher, and anybody in education will tell you, you go into a hands-on classroom and you watch everybody. You know, I was just down there a couple of weeks ago into our STEM classroom. They're building a house. I walked into the room. I'm going to tell this story, I think, at the banquet. I walked into the room and a student met me at the door and he said, hey, Dr. Smith, you're just in time. We're pouring concrete. You got to check it out. And I thought, pouring concrete? Cool. Well, yeah, I went in there and they're making this 4x4 scale smart house type thing, and they're pouring concrete for the foundation. And there was maybe a dozen kids in there, and every brain cell they had going was focused on that project, right? I mean, they are all in, gathered around, collaborating, critical thinking. Sweet. Let's do this, let's do that. I mean, the teacher just got to sit back and watch. I mean, but there was nothing distracting them. Nobody was bored. Nobody was, because everything that they had, like you said, mind, body, spirit, was all in. And that's every teacher's dream, if you can get that in front of you. So, to outsource that to a device as wonderful as
not
Google
possible.
search is, and we all love the ready answers, right? It just doesn't stick in long term, and the likelihood of that. So teachers have to come along and obviously cultivate that, bring it out, and things like that. Yeah, great point. Yeah. There was a recent article, Christianity Today, and I don't know how recent it's been, but I know I read it. You probably read it. How do you respond when people say, hey, that public school, for better or for worse, it's a great training ground for my child as a believer, and I want to be there as mom or dad for them when they go through those hard times in public education. And so that's the real world that's going to happen. And so I want them to fight those battles while they're still with me, as opposed to maybe college when they're not with me or they're out on their own. And so I want them to come home and tell me about today's battles, and we'll figure it out together, and I'll be their advocate as they're growing through public education. I know when I read that, lots of red flags went up there. But how do you respond when you hear some of those things? And did you read that article?
I did. That was from our theology editor at Christianity Today, and they had published, it was an opinion piece. They'd published a handful of, kind of opposing views on that subject, but actually did write a response to it that ran in National Review a couple weeks after that, because my sense was, and I appreciate what she's saying. I do think there is a lot of research to back up sort of, what's called like the inoculation theory, which is that if you expose your kids to counter arguments, let's use spirituality as an example, to Christian truth when they're young, that can go a long way as far as increasing their confidence in their faith when they get older. If they never hear any counter arguments, or they're not even aware that people don't believe in Jesus until they go away to college, then that's going to feel like an emergency to them. You could understand they go to college and hear a counter argument and think, why did my parents never tell me? Were they afraid that this might be true? All of that is true and worthwhile. My first reaction to that, to be honest, was if you think that the main concern about parents sending their kids to public school is that they're going to be teased or bullied for being Jesus followers, I think that could have been a main concern in maybe 1992. I think at this point, I mentioned the literacy rate in my public school district. Nationally, the literacy rate among public school fourth graders is in the low 30s. At this point, public schools are just simply not teaching kids at all. And like I said at the beginning, I do think that the spiritual questions and the ideological questions are directly related to the academic failures of the school. But even if that was a secondary concern, I think for Christians it should be of primary concern, their spiritual formation. But even if it were secondary, I still don't see an argument for sending your kids to public school. They're just not, I want my kids to learn how to read. I want them to learn math and physics. And frankly, they're just not learning that. And that is a problem at scale. That doesn't mean that there aren't, individual public schools that are doing better in some areas of the country. But generally speaking, it is more likely than not that the public school you would send your kids to is not teaching kids adequately. But the other problem is, the way I think about this, and I owe this thinking to John, because we've talked about this before, is that, there's sometimes you'll hear people say you should send your kids in part to a public school because they need to be a light in the darkness. And I appreciate the heart behind that. I also think that I do not expect my kids to be missionaries because they're kids. They're not ready for that yet. And I think if you are an adult who wants to be a public school teacher or an administrator or somehow get involved with public school, I think if you feel called to do that, that's great. And if you view that as a mission ground, I will pray for you every day. I think that's a wonderful thing. It is a fully separate question when you're talking about sending your children there to do that. And like I said, I think the ability to inoculate your kids against bad ideas or counter arguments to Christianity, that's not taken off the table when you don't put them in public school. Our Christian school here teaches world religions. My girls already, my third grader is already well aware that Christianity is not the only faith system. It's the true one, but lots of people don't believe it. And there's lots of questions that people have about it. it's not as if you cannot teach your kids that way if they're not in public school. And I think we have a duty to do that. I'm not willing to send them somewhere, where they will be outright told that, maybe they're in the wrong body, for example, or people who love Jesus are bigots or whatever. Not only that, but they're also just not going to learn. I mean, I'm not going to subject them to that.
Yeah, great points. I don't think people realize, and the last part of what you said there, I want to just hop on. I don't think people realize because there's a stereotype that, oh, you're indoctrinating them. They're only going to hear this one thing. The Christian schools of today, they are not doing that. They are well aware that these children are not sheltered by any means. I don't think there is such a thing anymore in this culture. I mean, nobody's immune from this. Obviously, Jonathan Haidt would support that in the whole smartphone and technology that they're seeing, and of course, and what they're exposed to. So we're doing the same thing. We're teaching them the intricacies of evolution so that they can defend creation.
Exactly.
Right? Because you have to understand those opponents' arguments. And so they do need to know exactly what else is out there and why it's not true. Instead of just saying, hey, I don't understand it either, but, this is all faith-based. And so we'll just, you just need to know that this is true and this is not. Christian schools aren't doing that. At least good Christian schools are not doing that. And they're, like you said, they're starting even at young ages to tell you, okay, you're going to see some things about Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, all these things. You're going to see and hear that stuff on a regular basis. And now you're maybe even going to see it on social media. You're not waiting for the nightly news like you and I were. And then maybe some adult would tell you something about it, right? That was the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Those days are over. These kids are seeing this stuff and they might assume, well, if such and such celebrity is of this world religion, maybe it's true. Maybe it's, XYZ. So if we don't teach those kids about it, they're going to, adopt that hook, line, and sinker. So Christian schools are doing exactly what you had said. And I couldn't agree more. And we could take that a lot of ways. Yeah.
My third grader just went on a field trip to a metro park, and they have this a sort of like a little museum of all, some taxidermied animals and, the different types of rocks that are found in this park. And the park ranger who was speaking to the class made a comment like this animal evolved over this amount of years. And it was such a cool moment because the class was like, hang on, what? And so they go back to school, and this is such a great opportunity for their teacher to say, so here's what some people think, and here's why that doesn't make sense, and here's why the evidence doesn't seem to back that up. But a lot of people around us think that, and really what they're doing is they're trying to look at the world without allowing God to be the author of it. And that can be very confusing. And that causes people to come up with all sorts of other It was just a really sweet, my girl came home really fired up about it, not angry, but excited because she felt like she was treated like an adult. She had an interesting conversation about two different viewpoints. And I don't know if you can tell, but in my house, that's kind of our love language. So she was very excited and it was a great thing, I think.
Right. And what you're talking about is just where I was going next. This idea of engaging the culture, that can happen, even at Christian schools. But what you're doing is you're training them to do it well and preparing them, because other parents will say, well, this public school is how we make sure we engage the culture through public schools. And we're going to be missionaries and things like that. And Alan Pugh writes in his book that your kids aren't missionaries, they're targets. And don't kid yourself. Most adults are having a hard time maintaining the testimony and being missionaries and things like, much less your 8-year-old. So I thought that was a good point as well. And so I like that story for the purpose of engaging the culture because you've been trained well to do that. And again, you're seeing those examples all around you. You just can't ignore it.
We have a game in our family that we lifted from our best friends who live in Arizona and have 2 kids about the same age as our kids. And the game is called Spot the Lie. And when they spot a lie and they come and tell us about it, they get a point. And so far we have never, I don't know what the prize is supposed to be. I think we're still thinking about that. We haven't given them a limit to the number of points, but it's so sweet. I mean, my 8-year-old is obsessed right now with space. And so we got her a book for Christmas about the planets and whatever. And there was a page in there about the Big Bang. And so she came and showed it to me and said, I think this might be a lie. And so she got some extra points for that. But it's a really sweet, they're very into it. And it just gets the wheels turning. Some people are going to say things that aren't true. it seems strange to an adult to have to learn that, but kids aren't born thinking that. Kids are born thinking everything people say is true. So it is a really critical lesson that that's not the case. And here's how we spot what's true and what's not.
That's a great, great idea. You're going to have to patent that. You're going to have to put it in writing. You're going to have to, this is fantastic.
I know. Copyright it.
Spot the lie.
Yeah.
Right. Spot the lie. You heard it here first. Yep. That's exactly right. Good for you. You're doing a great job as a mom. Well, as I mentioned, I'm in the Colson Fellows program. Love that. Again, I think you guys just do great work there. And already, and I've only been in it since, this summer, but already 2 major themes kind of been running throughout. And so I wanted you to maybe speak to, are you seeing those things, especially with John, like every issue you talk about maybe comes back to those things, but at least 2 things are standing out. This idea of the importance of being made in God's image, that if you could get that right, that certainly cures a lot of social ills. I'm hearing that as a theme over and over. And then also this idea of we are engaged in kingdom work. And, Christ said, dozens and dozens of times in all those New Testament books, my kingdom has come. I'm building my kingdom here. And you need to engage the culture because you're part of my kingdom. And we want, obviously, more believers in God's kingdom. So those 2 themes, which have been great for me. I mean, as a longtime believer, I knew that, but I'm learning those anew and afresh so much more and in a clearer way through this program. Are those running themes for you and John as you come through these social issues all the time on the show? What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think it's everything. I think it just kind of gives language, I think, to, like you said, these are things you already knew as a Christian, but it's a way of categorizing, sort of the challenges that are before us. And I think the made in God's image one is so crucial. Both of them are, and I'm glad you asked, because I've thought so much about this over the past few years. It comes up again and again in my conversations with John. And I think sometimes talking about being made in God's image can sound really esoteric. Like, what does that mean? That I physically look like God? If I look in the mirror, I look like God? What that's talking about, I think, is what it means to be a human being. And that, first of all, nothing else that God created did he say that about it. So we are the only created beings that were made in his image. Secondly, it means that we have some really crucial things in common with God, which means we were designed in a certain way. Now, I don't think the Bible gives us explicitly every answer and explanation for exactly how we were made and exactly what we need, but it does say explicitly that we were designed in a certain way with a certain purpose. And I think most of the ideological challenges that are facing us and our kids today have to do with the notion that we were not designed in a certain way. This is where you get sort of gender confusion. And we were not designed with a purpose. This is where you get the idea that we really should have the right to do whatever we want with our bodies, to do whatever we want with our lives. Anything that suggests that we have a responsibility to ourselves or to one another is, toxic. And this is really just a free-for-all. Autonomy is the God. And that, the highest order, and that's how we should order our lives around that principle. Well, if we were made with a purpose and in a certain way, then you just can't go down that route. Our job then is to determine what is that purpose and how were we made. And I would argue that some of the things we're seeing, like, for example, the mental challenges related to technology is directly related to the endeavor to sort of replace or mimic the physical world in a digital way. That, and the fact that that's hurting us as badly and as quickly as it is, points to the fact that, okay, one of the things about being made in God's image means that we're physical and we live in a physical world, and that it's important, and that we can know God more and better, and we are healthier when we engage the physical world and when we don't allow things to take its place or to pretend that it can take its place. So there's like hints all over the place about who we are and what it means to be human. And then I think that the kingdom work is the sort of why were we made? And that is, I think the animating principle, at least I hope it is, of my life is that I recognize fully that I don't know what heaven, I don't know what the restoration of creation is going to look like exactly, but I know that my job for as long as I'm here is to try and build the world that God intended when he first created the world as best as I can, in whatever small role that I play. And obviously my most important role is as a mom to my girls. So my chief concern is that they understand who they are, who people are, what the world is like, what God has chosen to reveal to us about the world. And we want to make the world as open and friendly for others to see that truth as we can make it, which means speaking about the gospel to people and sharing, the way that Jesus has changed us, but also just being people who refuse to tell lies about the world, which includes, refusing to tell lies about our bodies, refusing to tell lies about what marriage is and what kids are and what pregnancy is and all these really big issues facing everybody. I mean, that's building the kingdom, I think.
Yeah, if we can get these young people to see that, listen, we cannot have you hit the sidelines. We have to have you make an impact. And we're not teaching every child, you need to run for president, you need to run for Senate, things like that. But we are saying, listen, you have to know what you believe and why you believe it, and you just cannot sit this out. And I get it now that I'm older, in my mid-50s. I can see how when you cross some of those age lines, you might be a little more despondent and say, you know what, I just don't know how we're going to push this ball, up the hill anymore. It's, look at all that's against us. Look at the tide. I used to be, as a young person, critical of senior citizens when I thought that they would kind of throw in the towel on some of those issues. Yeah. Well, now that I'm a little older, I'm thinking, it's going to be tough. You're going to have some energy, but more than energy, I just want them to have some conviction and to say, like you said, that no, if this is not true, well, then I'm not going to just camp out over here, because exactly like you said, the culture wants us to say, hey, that faith is fine, but keep it to yourself. It doesn't belong in the public sphere, and you can have that. And of course, John, I know I can hear you too in the back of my mind talking about the sacred and secular divide, and the private religious matters being, in that private sphere, but they don't belong. Exactly. Personal, private, right? Exactly. And so just getting them to say, listen, you can't retreat from what's going on. You don't necessarily have to look at it as a fight all the time. Look at it optimistically and say, hey, this is my opportunity to do what it is I've been designed to do as a child of God and made in his image. I got to build this kingdom. Because even though our schools and my life is all about discipleship, we're certainly starting with evangelism and trying to make sure that we're a good testimony and reaching people for Christ and then helping them learn and grow. So I appreciate that, and well said. And like I said, I think that's a valuable thread that we're seeing woven throughout just about everything. And I'm going to start using it more and more with my kids here at school, because I think those are big concepts for them to really identify with and to grab a hold of. I don't think they really understand it. Most teens don't, but if we can do that good job in really teaching that here at schools, we'll be better off. What do you see as we kind of maybe wrap up and look towards the future? What are some big cultural issues on the horizon that you maybe are tracking because you do this kind of for a living, that Christians should kind of have on their radar? And I'm sure some of them, in light of what we've just said, hey, how can it get any worse? We're questioning fixed biology. I don't know how it can get any worse, right? But what are some things that maybe if you could give some advice to our listeners, say, hey, keep this in mind, what this is perhaps what's coming down the road?
Yeah, sure. Oof, that's a big question. I think probably the biggest issue philosophically, related to what it means to be made in God's image, is this idea of autonomy. I mean, I'm thinking about, so I have a piece coming out in Christianity Today in November that I've spent several months working on about drug decriminalization. So the state of Oregon decriminalized drugs in 2021, and it was a disaster, and so many people have died, and they have since recriminalized drugs, and there's a lot of Christian ministries out there trying to help. And I know that, there are Christian ministries all over the country that are helping people in recovery. But what it points to for me is this larger question of, because all the arguments for decriminalizing were sort of, people have the right to do what they want. We shouldn't criminalize people. It's sort of like the grade school epithet of like, well, it's not hurting anybody else, and people have the right to do what they want with their own bodies. And I think that is such a dangerous idea that we're seeing everywhere, that we're seeing that in discussions about abortion, in discussions about, gender and sexuality, assisted dying, essentially, you know, it's a euphemism, but that's what they call it. I mean, the MAID program in Canada, and some things in the UK. All of this swirls around questions of what it means to be human and what we kind of owe ourselves and each other. And I think it's almost like a badly written, you know, sci-fi novel where we're kind of autonomizing ourselves into non-existence. I mean, even the falling birth rate is, I think, a huge crisis that we're going to feel more and more as the years go by. And that's directly related to this because people don't understand why children. People just don't. People think of having children as sort of there's a lifestyle choice as opposed to the normal order. You know, when the majority of people get married, which I think is the design, then the normal order is having children because that's the way marriage works. Well, we have all this technology now that allows us to think that it doesn't have to work that way and that we get to pick and choose how or when or how many or how we do this. And that has led to some incredible changes in not just like population in aggregate, but also the way we view life. So I guess to put a pin on it, I would say, you know, if you're a parent, I think the biggest challenge to our Christian worldview coming down the pike in a philosophical sense is this idea of who are we and who do we belong to, if anybody? What responsibilities do we have to ourselves? And, you know, really that argument of autonomy, it cannot be the highest good because it devolves really into self-destruction. And our kids are kind of swimming in water that is going to tell them that is what the highest good is. And we have to really provide a better vision, I think.
Right. Yeah, well said. Those are great words. Excited to read that piece that's coming out. I think that's going to be great. Yeah. And then the book you referenced as well. That's so good. Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, right. Yes. Bottom line, you just cannot have no culture can exist where it's just all about me, obviously. It's all about my own autonomy, myself. What rights do I have? You know, if I'm not existing for the common good or some greater cause that's outside of myself, if everybody is saying that, eventually you just self-destruct, right? You turn inward and you self-destruct, and that's probably where we're headed. I certainly didn't say it anywhere nearly as well as you did, but trying to just, like you said, put a pin on it and wrap it up as well. So great words. Yeah. I so appreciate that.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you,
well,
Dr.
listen,
Smith,
as
so
we
much,
close. Yeah, you're more than welcome. Listen, as we close, if they can follow you, what should they do? Where should they go? If they want to know more about Maria Baer, if they want to know more about Breakpoint, which we've talked about, or the Colson Center, should they just hit the website? Where should they go? Because I'm sure listeners are going to want to follow along.
Yes. So thank you. You can go to breakpoint.org. It's all one word, breakpoint.org, to see the work of the Colson Center. And I mean, you can find the podcast there as well, but you can also find the podcast just anywhere you listen to podcasts. Just search the word Breakpoint and it will come up. John and I's kind of longer look at culture, those episodes happen every Friday. So I think those usually hit Friday evenings, and we have so much fun doing that. So please join us over there if you're interested. I assume if you're listening to this, you're a podcast person, so check out the Breakpoint podcast. As far as my work, I have a Substack newsletter that you can find at just Maria Baer, and it's Baer. mariabaer.substack.com, which I update pretty regularly. And then I also have just a website where I sort of collect all of the links to my pieces that are running elsewhere. So it's just mariaebaer.com. If you go there, you'll see links to, you know, whatever my recent pieces have been. So there's links to pieces in Christianity Today and in World and National Review and wherever else I've been published recently. So that's kind of where you can find me.
Well, you do a ton of things. Again, keep up the great work and juggle it all well, as I know you're doing right now. And again, we just think so highly of you and John and all your ministries, and Aaron, of course, as well. Looking forward to seeing you both very, very soon. So again, thanks so much.
Yes.
Great words, great wisdom, and certainly Lord bless you in all of your works. And thank you again for joining me today on the Clearly Christian podcast. And I trust that now you know more about what it's going to take in this culture to raise a child that's mentally, emotionally and spiritually healthy. Again, if you like the show, you've been listening, certainly follow along, subscribe, hit the like button, let others know the show's worth checking out, and we certainly would appreciate that. And as I say at the close of every show, the only way we're going to turn things around in this country is to increase the number of people who live and operate every day with a biblical worldview, who think like us on these issues. And the greatest hope that we have to get there is Christian education. I'm Dr. Cy Smith, and this is Clearly Christian.
Thank you for listening to the Clearly Christian podcast with Dr. Cy Smith. Hear more episodes at clearlychristianeducation.com. If you'd like more information about Christian education in your neighborhood, or if you're interested in education opportunities at Mansfield Christian School, or if you agree with Dr. Smith and want to help him in his mission to influence and awaken Christian America, you can send Dr. Smith an email through the clearlychristianeducation.com website. Message him on the Clearly Christian LinkedIn or Facebook page, or call the Clearly Christian Connection line at 419-756-5651. This has been the Clearly Christian Podcast with Dr. Cy Smith on clearlychristianeducation.com, brought to you in conjunction with Mansfield Christian School, a Bryan Media production.